Miriam Wells, Impact Editor at the Bureau of Investigative Journalism, a non-profit organization dedicated to hold the power to account, tackling big subjects through deep reporting. Chrissie Giles, editor at Mosaic, which is a site dedicated to telling stories about science, which is part of Welcome, which is a foundation dedicated to ELF. When we were discussing and we were prepping for the discussion, I started by saying that I cannot imagine any journalist or really anyone who gets into journalism who doesn't want their stories to have an impact on the readers. Yet, what impact is and how we measure it, it's been very hard to define. Miriam, your job is, the DNA of your job is impact. Tell us more about what does it mean.
What the job means or impact
Both.
itself? Okay, well, I don't know if any of you know the Bureau at all, but as Federica said, we're the UK's largest non-profit news organisation, and we are a public interest news organisation. So I guess in a nutshell, I mean, we exist to serve the public interest. So if we're serving the public interest effectively is what is the impact that we seek to make. But I mean, in terms of how it can be defined, it's something that the journalism industry has struggled with over a number of years, and there's been a bit of sometimes been a bit of a pushback. I'd say traditionally, impact has been thought of as that kind of top-level policy change. You know, someone gets fired, there's a law change, someone gets prosecuted, but increasingly we're realising that there's so much more, that there's so much more of a role that journalism plays, and I certainly feel that way. I don't know to how long I should talk right now, but I could talk about some of the ways that we feel journalism plays a role.
Yep.
Okay, so we have that top-down policy change, high-level impact that I've just described. We also have, from the bottom up, how can journalism really serve the communities that it's writing about or it's writing with? How can it empower and equip communities affected by the issues it's writing on? But also something that has not been thought about so much, but that we feel is probably the most powerful way that journalism can make an impact, is how it can strengthen the existing networks of organisations and people that are already working on the issues in question. You know, journalism doesn't change things on its own. I mean, very occasionally it can do, with the really huge publication and the really huge story. But even then, it's likely that there was already a lot of work going on, an existing movement or existing events that had taken place before that. And journalism can play a really key role in strengthening those kind of networks. Lawyers, MPs, NGOs, campaigners, just people that are already working on the issues. And that's a key way that the Bureau certainly has made it's some of its greatest impact in the past. We take a lot of kind of proactive steps to try and make sure that our work can most effectively strengthen existing movements. So other than the traditional journalistic output, we also, for instance, submit evidence to inquiries, or we've worked with lawyers who've used our findings as evidence in cases. We work with academics where what they're doing feeds into what we're doing and vice versa. I'm probably rambling a bit now, so I'll wrap it up. But that's one of the, the strengthening at that network level, I think, is one of the most key ways that journalism can
we'll get
have an impact.
Into it a bit more later. But Chrissie, can you tell us about Mosaic and how do you think about impact in your role?
So Mosaic's quite interesting because it's funded by and lives within basically a health charity. So unlike lots of other kind of non-profit who will be applying to separate funders for resource, we were born within Welcome. And that's great from a resource and editing point of view, but it's also difficult because I think for us it's about how do you show the impact you're having on the world. So not only you want to show impact for the organisation, but you also obviously want to show impact in the wider world. And I think what's trickier for us, we don't really do investigative journalism, but we do kind of long-form stories about science and health. Sometimes they might be about the use of single-use plastics in science labs, or it might be something about, a condition called dysphagia where you can't swallow properly. And I think with some of our stories, you can read them, or my mum will read them and say, "Oh, that was nice," and you're like, "Thanks, Mum." But you kind of, beyond paying a journalist to write it and editing it and it going on the site, you kind of think, what impact did it have? So we've started looking at impact in terms of what the, I've got to get it right, the Centre for Investigative Reporting in the US has done with their tracker. So they have these really, I'm just going to get this because my memory is not great. So they have these kind of micro, meso, macro levels of impact, and also media. They have a really nice kind of open source database. You can grab it off GitHub. Is that right?
Yeah.
People at work were talking about someone called Jason for about 10 years, and then someone's like, it's not a person. We're like, what? Also, who the hell's, who's that? So, for example, for us, we might have a micro thing. So we publish things on our own site, but actually we publish under Creative Commons license. So much like kind of Wikipedia and other places, anyone can take our content and republish it. So if someone's read it on our site, we know probably 20 times more people have read it on The Guardian, or they've gone to the link through Hacker News, or they've gone to The Independent, or whatever. So actually, we have quite an interesting thing where we don't have comments on our site, but we might see comments on the bottom of a Guardian story or a Daily Mail story. So we decided from the start that we would collect all this information. So we use somebody remotely through one of these kind of remote working sites, and she goes through and follows all the wormholes in Twitter and Facebook and other people's comments. So we have this massive, we filled a Google sheet, I didn't know it's possible, we filled 2 Google sheets of kind of this tweets, Facebook's comment stuff, which we haven't quite worked out what to do. So we've got that kind of level of stuff. We've got like someone's republished it. That's great for us. And we have one in 5.5 years, one policy change, which was around Chile adopting a law, a process in Iceland where they basically set curfews so teenagers stopped doing all the fun, naughty stuff. They had to be home, they had after-school clubs. That's our one policy impact. But I would say when you talk about impact with other journalists, you hear about policy change, law change. That is so hard. And we don't do investigative stuff that's even harder.
Well, I would say it's often not. You can never say, I mean, almost never, and probably I would say never, you can say, oh, this story or even this body of work resulted in this policy change. Yeah. But you can measure various ways in which there are things you can count that definitely might have contributed. You know, how many times has an MP cited this piece of work? How many times has an NGO used this in a report and so on? And, it's that. You can measure kind of the contributions to a wider...
It's hard to track that, though. We have a...
Well, with this, the way that I was talking about the 3 divisions actually really is a mirror of that micro, meso, and, you've got the community level, ground up, micro stuff. You've got the meso.
Yeah. It's just labour intensive to put that into a database. But then you could theoretically pick a story and it would show you all of the types of impact, the dates. You could look at like, oh, look, we had a big rash of like book proposals. Or, the other thing we think about is the impact on the people in our stories. So we do a lot of kind of patient stories, and some of the things we're kind of proudest of on a human level, I guess, is this piece about dysphagia we did about not being able to swallow. It like really ruins your life. You can't eat, you can't drink, your family are terrified, you lose weight, doctors are like, nyeh. So we did basically a long read on that, and we had an email from a man in America who'd said he'd printed it out and taken it to his doctor, and he's like, no one understands what it's like. And it's not that we did it, it's that someone did it. And now we know, like, people are sharing that information, but how do we track that? Someone emailed us. We don't know otherwise, and that's the thing for me. I'm like, we could be having all these impacts we don't know about.
But so even the impact tracker of the Center of Investigative Reporting is a tool that lets you capture information on a qualitative level. Like, you gather qualitative feedback. Is there a point to try to find another quantitative measure for impact, or it's just about finding a proxy for that?
Right. Well, at the moment, my role is a new role. We've been thinking about impact for a very long time, and it's always been part of what we do, but it's a new role. And what I really want to do before I get to the measurement part is really, really get into the nuts and bolts of, what do we want to achieve and why, and what are our metrics of success before we think about measurement. I think that for the past few years, all of the discussion, or a lot of the discussion around impact in journalism has been really focused on how do we measure it. For good reason, because funders of philanthropically funded journalism, whoa, how's that echo happening? Are you getting that?
I like
it. We've had to show funders what our impact is, and so that's kind of how this whole thing started, right, how are we going to show them in a measured way what impact we've made. But really, there should be a broader, deeper philosophical discussion, I think, about what it really means and what role journalism plays in society before we get to the tools for how we measure it. And so that doesn't really answer your question, but I'm just trying to steer away from the measurement.
No, discussion. But if we move away from the measurement, what, thinking about impact and however you report back to funders on impact, it's quite typical on a funded and non-profit funded organization. Is there also a business case for
100%,
impact, and is that something that every newsroom should be thinking about?
I mean, we certainly think so at the Bureau. We know that there is, we know that there's a complete crisis of trust in news. We know that there's a complete breakdown of traditional revenue models in journalism, and we know that those two things are really connected. Obviously, there are other major factors. I'm not going to speak about them too loudly in the Google headquarters, but trust is a big one. And if we can really, every time that we positively impact society and communicate that, and every time a lawmaker cites our work, or every time a community or an individual is really feels the value of our work, every time just every time we are doing something useful for society and people appreciate that, that's when we start to rebuild some of that trust. And when people really start to trust us again, they value what we do and they will support us. I mean, that's our kind of hypothesis anyway. We'll see how well it bears fruit. But we're already seeing with the Guardian and the New York Times, they're really successfully communicating the value of their journalism, the impact of their journalism. People are supporting them. So it's already proving itself true to a certain extent so far.
From an editor's point of view, we're all working with limited and kind of shrinking resources. So being able to see what has impact and what doesn't, and unpicking why, is great for commissioning in the future, saying, well, that didn't work, why not? And actually, when people pitch to us now, one of the questions we ask the journalists to answer is like, what change are you trying to create in the world? And that's a really hard question. I mean, quite often it's just like, TK, and we're like, sure, tell us later. But I think if you're just doing something because it's some kind of like vanity thing, or it's okay to be really interested in a topic and fascinated by it, but also why are you wanging around taking all this time to tell people, about it if you're not trying to change something? And I think just having that honest conversation with somebody, and even writing a headline that you think is summing up the journey you're taking someone on, this isn't new thinking, but I think it bears repeating that otherwise we're all wasting our time.
A bit of a broader perspective, we've mentioned a lot change and driving a change action. Where is the line between impact and journalism and activism?
This is a really good question, and one that I'm going to have to answer a lot as the role continues. Although before I get onto that question, I just wanted to say about the word change and impact. I mean, I'm struggling because there's no real good word to describe it, but I'd say impact doesn't always have to mean change. It could, if you're just providing something of value that really, benefits an affected community, for instance, there might not be any tangible change that's occurred, but you've still had this, I guess you could describe it as change potentially, but the word change needs to sum up that there's something kind of bigger that you can see has changed, but it might just be that someone, a community is better able to mobilise, for instance. But so the line between advocacy and journalism is really, this is a really important discussion. And obviously anything that compromises the integrity of journalism, especially a public interest and philanthropically funded organisation like the Bureau, whose reputation is, bound upon, the robustness and quality of its journalism. I mean, I'm sure all organisations would say that, but we can't look like we are just trying to find evidence that suits an agenda. I'd say that's the key difference. You've got journalism starts with a question and then follows the evidence, whereas a campaigner would sort of start with the answer and then find the evidence that supports that. But there isn't a line where it's like one or the other, I don't think. You have this kind of spectrum where you have sort of very kind of hard news, like say BBC would be a good example at one end, and then you'd have the really, really kind of overtly campaigning organisations like, I don't know, like PETA for animal rights on the other. But then you've got a lot of in-between organisations, a lot of the stuff that Human Rights Watch does is a form of journalism for sure. You've got Global Witness and Greenpeace that have their investigative units, and then you kind of go back down the track. But I think having an impact editor is a really important role, certainly at the Bureau, in terms of being that bridge, so the journalism is, because a large part of it is, I think, building a lot of links and properly meaningful relationships with, as I've said, organisations and other people that are working on the issues. But if you've got the impact editor sort of act as the bridge, being the one that has those meaningful relationships, the journalism is a bit more protected. But I don't have the answer to the question, but it's a really important discussion and one that we're thinking about a lot. What do you think? It's a bit trickier for you because you've got so we're funded,
the NGO is part of it. Yeah, we're funded by Wellcome, but we don't do what they tell us. I mean, we fund within the remit of what they would fund, so we're not allowed to do dinosaurs or space. I'm like, come on, throw me a bone here. But beyond that, if we have any... So we get pitched a lot from US writers, and the Wellcome Trust isn't known there at all, really. So quite often, if somebody suggests a Wellcome idea, they're like, oh. I'm like, oh, the people that fund us also funded this thing, and you can go and see this guy in the lab, and that's fine. But actually, we're just totally transparent about it. So if we cover a story that's got Wellcome funding somehow embroiled in it, we'll say that. But also, there's like so much science and health. There's so many stories in the world. We're not there. I mean, Wellcome has its own website on which it does its own stories. And I think because we're CC BY, we're really trying to just... I guess we're trying to be there to improve the quality of science and health journalism by kind of making it, rather than being a press officer who might place a story. So I think we're kind of trying to improve it by being there and doing it. And also, we know some of the impacts we measure are to do with the writers that work with us. So somebody might write their first kind of long form piece, so maybe 5,000 words. They might come to Mosaic and learn to do that. It takes a long time. There's a lot of editing. There's a fact check. There's a copy edit. There's a legal check. I'm sure by the end of it, they're like, this is not where the extremely fair rate we offer. But we know that people have gone on, and because it's CC BY, they might use their feature as like a sample chapter in a book review, or so we've got plenty of examples where people have done anthologies. Someone's published 2 whole anthologies just of Mosaic stories because the license is free. And you might be like, why is she wanging on about books? The impact is that somebody is maybe in a bookshop and they pick up this book and they've read something about science they wouldn't ordinarily have read. It happens to be funded by Wellcome, but it's like so far removed from somewhere Wellcome would be in the world. I mean, you could stop somebody outside the Wellcome Trust headquarters in Euston and they wouldn't know what the big building was. And I think that's an interesting part of a foundation, is like, what are we funding everything we fund for? But yeah, I think being able to do long stories at a time where, journalism is really struggling is great. And I think we've got evidence to show that people engage with longer, in-depth stories in a way that isn't the same as engaging with shorter news stories. I think it's really important, and more people should fund it. It shouldn't have to just come from philanthropies, but that's for another day.
Before we open up to question from the public, is there an aspect, a negative aspect of impact and the harm that it could potentially cause that needs to be considered? For example, a distressful photo or video from Syria might have a very big impact. But are we then risking of crossing the line? Are we desensitizing people by using? Is there something as trying to have too much impact?
I mean, I think there's obviously journalism can have a very negative impact, and we see that happening a lot in lots of different ways all around the world. I mean, in terms of how that might impact what effect what the Bureau does and how we do our work. I mean, we were talking before, but it's the duty of care aspect is hugely important to us whenever we write a story involving vulnerable people or anyone really. It's, and I think that's just a sort of tenet of responsible journalism, isn't it? Really thinking through what are the potential consequences for the people involved in this story of us publishing it. What are the potential consequences on them of having spoken to us and the experience of speaking to us and the experience of seeing that go out. There are all sorts of things you have to think about when you're doing journalism responsibly. So, I mean, we would hope that we would always seek to mitigate, we would seek to not have a negative impact on our contributors. And if it's unavoidable and they want to go ahead anyway, then how can we mitigate that and so on? I think the question of, more broadly, how does news negatively impact society is more of a broader discussion that isn't so much around the impact editor role, but it's certainly a discussion we could have, but maybe not now. What do you think?
Yeah, I think you're right. It's just about editorial standards. So what's quite interesting, every story we release, because it's CC BY, anyone can take it and kind of re-headline it, and they can edit it as long as they don't introduce errors. So it's kind of fun for us to write a headline that we think is responsible, that the lawyers have okayed, that isn't going to get Wellcome in reputational rubbish, that isn't going to make us sound like shrill or unreasonable. And then you see it in other publications and you're like, oh,
yeah, we have this.
We got told not to say that. And the other day it's like, don't say the phrase big pharma. It's just better to not say it. We're like, okay. And then you see
it gets engagement.
Yeah. It's like, we once had a headline day, and the guy came in, and he was like an ex-Fleet Street guy, and he was like, right, let's have a fun time. We're all there with our really clever puns. He's like, puns are just for indoors. don't let a pun go out. You're all very clever people. And we were like completely chided. But now we have our headline meeting. We're all just like, this is massively inappropriate and we shouldn't say it. And puns are terrible. And then we do our extremely straight headline. And then someone puts it on another site with like an irresponsible one. We're like, yes. But with things like images and... So it's like we're almost giving, with each piece we do, because we only do one a fortnight, we sound like complete dossers. It's hard, they're long. But each writer we're almost giving a bit more of a platform. So it's not that they can completely opine, but they are named, bylined, they're there, there's a bio. But I think if wherever someone's really on one side or the other of a debate, we're very much like, you've got to present both sides, not the fake balance BBC thing, but present the evidence. We're here about presenting the evidence and letting people decide themselves. It doesn't mean that the person's not going to wrap up by being like, personally, I think this. But yeah, it's just like, would you want to see this? Would you be proud if like someone in your family had seen you make that? If it was your relative or you spilling their guts and then having it like, oh, look at this person, they've got 3 eyes. You'd be like, sad times. But also, maybe it's great. I shouldn't be sorry. If anyone's got 3 eyes, I'm really sorry. But also, we've done work with like marginalised groups before. So people who have disabilities, people who are in a hospice who are dying. And whenever I've done work with them, and we're like, we can pseudonymise you. We don't have to use photos. They're like, I want my story out there. I want to be seen. This is like what I'm doing. This is my legacy.
They want to have a voice.
Yeah, and you're actually disempowering people by not giving them that option. And quite often with lawyers, we have to be like, I know it's great if we don't name this like 16-year-old, but he wants to be named, his parents want to be named, they've got this amazing story, and I think, yeah, it's like...
Yeah, we had this exact same situation with women that had been survivors of domestic violence perpetrated by police officers, and so, yeah, they were, their safety was 100% going to be jeopardised, so we couldn't name them, but, they really wanted to be named. Yeah, similar kind of dilemma.
Liz, do we have time for question?
10 minutes, 5 minutes.
Yeah, 5 minutes.
Okay. Very keen.
Yeah.
I'm worried about this.
Yeah.
Hi, Jasper Jackson from the New Statesman. So you're talking a lot about like measuring impact and talking to funders and trying to work out what you think is important. How do you convey the more sophisticated concepts of impact back to journalists who are doing the stories in a way that's useful to them in terms of, because we talk about metrics, etc., and what metrics you convey back to journalists, but if you're talking about, whether you've made a policy change, etc., what are the mechanisms by which you make people realise that they are having an impact beyond page views, which is what most journalists are now trained to do?
Well, I mean, it might take 5 years, that's a slight issue. So one of the we need to be better at doing this from our point of view, but about a year after someone's published something, you might enter an award. So you have to do those 500-word blurb. And actually, that's a really nice chance for us to go back and say, who republished this? Did we see any like big flame war debates on whatever? So we actually pull a little package together, and then we might go back to the journalist then and say, this did really well. Sometimes things don't do well on our own site, but they get picked up by Guardian long reads, and they suddenly got a ton of views. I mean, it is really hard. And sometimes for us, stories that feel really important don't have that much measurable impact. And that's the thing for me where I'm like, I would still publish this story, but it's had not many views and not many republishes.
That's only one form of impact, though.
Yes. What's the impact I'm talking about? Like that?
Well, we didn't even get into that. But for us, it's a bit different. I mean, at the Bureau, the journalists, it almost happens the other way around. The journalists are covering the topics that they're covering for very long periods of time. It can be sort of 2 or 3 years or more that they're on a particular topic or beat. And if you're doing your beat really well, you know what's going on, and you actually, you know a lot of what we're sort of talking about, as in, an MP used this work, or, a policy change. That is the kind of stuff that they're going to know about because they're following it. They're following what's happening in the space. In terms of those kind of metrics, for sure, that's the kind of stuff we would need to feed back. How many people have, the reach, the how many times has it been republished, and so on. But the impact editor shouldn't be something that sits in the side of the newsroom, just sort of siloed off from everybody else. That in fact, it's thinking about how the work can really help drive change is part of the reporter's job description, and also sort of monitoring what's happening in the space that they've written about as well. So,
I mean, if you really want to if you're feeling a bit big-headed and you really want to sober up a little bit, if you do 5,000-word features and you plug in Hotjar, you can see how far down people get, and it goes like red, 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 blue, dead. And that's quite interesting. And obviously it's only a very small sample of your readers, but things like that. We also do like net promoter scores and things like that. And, you know, leave comments in the box, are you repeat visitors or not? And all those things, they're all part of, like you say, they're all proxies, but I think together you can kind of get a kind of feel.
Yeah, that kind of stuff in terms of practicality, we feed back, and, you know, we have a weekly email in terms of like summing up what's happened across the organisation and with all of the stories. So, I mean, we're only a small organisation. There's sort of 20 of us. I mean, we're rapidly growing, but there's only 20 of us at the moment. So it's quite easy to, you know, communicate everything we need to communicate easily.
Thank you. One of the things that hasn't been brought up yet, we've talked about, you know, what happens when you succeed and, you know, how to sort of measure that. I'm wondering how you both deal with failure. So when an article doesn't get the impact you want, you think it's a fantastic story, really good investigation, really good piece, and it just flops. What process do you guys go through to analyse what went wrong or what could have been done better? And I guess also if it has a negative impact, to say there's a piece that does lead to a policy change, but it's the opposite of the policy change you want to achieve because they're doing things short-term to cover their arses. How do you deal with those kind of situations?
I mean, I guess it's sort of just what you described. We have debriefs after big stories, and we look at what went well, what didn't go well, what we can learn. You know, there's always going to be things that didn't go well and that could be improved upon. And so we just make sure that we don't do this for every story, but certainly with the big pieces, we, you know, after say a month, we reflect on everything that happened, and yeah, that's the process, I guess. But it is like feedback and reflection is really, really important, I think.
No, we're the same. You have some pieces that you love. We did this piece about a guy who'd written about, it's basically Tinder but for heart surgery. I mean, we should have called it that. It was called like Swipe Right to Save a Life or Left, I don't know which. It was a really great piece. We had this amazing novelist write it, and he went to Haiti, and you basically go online to give money to basically American surgeons who fly in and do work for free to fix people's hearts after they've had basically a sore throat when they're a kid. And it was an incredible story, and you go on the site and there's the people and they have a little bio and you're almost choosing who to help, and that's so weird and like Black Mirror, but it's real and it's happening. And it's the worst performing story on our site out of 270 stories over 5 years. And it's awful. And sometimes it doesn't make sense. Sometimes like world news, life is happening. You like poop out a little long read and people are just like, sorry, world's happening. The thing I think we take sucker from is that the stories we do are kind of, we want them to be like chapters in a book and to have like longevity. So quite often we might find a publication would be like, oh, we'd like to republish the story maybe 6 months after we've republished it. And because they're kind of written, they're like timely, but they also have like timelessness and timeliness. So I live with the hope that like good stories will live on and the long tail is long, and that we can either re-promote them later. We do podcasts of all our stories, an audio version, so that gives them another chance to go out into the world. And also, I guess sometimes not everything works, but maybe it only got read by a handful of people, but those people might have really gone, whoa.
Yeah, I mean, I was just going to say, that it might not have been read by many people, but there's stories that haven't done very well in terms of reach, but have had really powerful impact. So,
So it's really hard.
Yeah.
Thank you very much.